I'm here with Zahn, who's a classmate of mine from the Merchant Marine Academy, graduating in, I believe, 1968. The reason that was particularly relevant was that was right at the height of the Vietnam War. And I've said over the years that there were two significant graduating groups out of the Merchant Marine Academy. One was in the mid-40s during the Second World War, and one was in the mid-60s during Vietnam. Everything is different in major wartime than peacetime. And that's kind of framed some of the beliefs and experiences that Kevin and I have had over the years. Kevin went on, sailed for some 20 years on and off on tankers and general cargo ships and dry bulk, all different types of ships, all different continents and oceans. And he's going to share some of those experiences with us. He went on to get a master's degree in education from Boston College and spent some time teaching. So he has some empathy for trying to communicate, with the current audience. Written a couple of books. The one book, which is required reading for IBUS 75, was sent to me by one of our classmates, and it was basically in a phone call, "Hey Guinea," which was my nickname at Kings Point. "Have you read the book Bucko made?" "No." "Well, you got to read it." So I read it. I then took it to my classes and had them read it. One of my students basically said in the review of the book it was basically the autobiography of the stories that I've been telling in class all these years. I introduce you to Kevin and ask you to give some of the consideration to some of his insights over his 20 years of sailing and plus years in the academic environment. Good morning, Kevin.
Professor Jim, good to see you.
So when we were chatting the other day, we were discussing the impact that going to Kings Point had on us as individuals as it relates to our current view of kind of the global situations that we face today. Could you maybe share some of that we talked about the other day?
Sure. Well, I was a boy in a small New England town. When I was 11, my father moved us all to Jacksonville, Florida in the 50s, 1958. And I went to finish sixth grade in a completely segregated school system. I went all the way through high school, never meeting one single person of any color, not just black kids. Black kids had to be bused across the river to go to their school. So my parents didn't socialize a lot, and I feel that later on I felt I grew up kind of in a very close environment. My parents weren't very open to new ideas and new people. And then, boom, I go to Kings Point, which I was trying to get in one of the military schools. It was not a surprise or a shock. It was one of my options. And all of a sudden, being a federal school, they didn't discriminate like my high school did. And I had to begin to get to know other people from other cultures. We had exchange students from Indonesia, if you recall. So when we went to sea, it really hit home because we go to sea on regular merchant ships. Now, some of the state academies, they have a school ship where they all go together. Ours is very different, and I think a whole lot better experience because you were working with 40 other guys in those days, all guys, engineers, maids, bosuns, crewmen from all over the world, and you have to learn to get along with them. You're all on the same ship. And then you go to foreign countries, and there you go again. You've got all these cultures that you heard about, or maybe you grew up hearing some prejudice against, and as you get to know people, you get to find out they're not all that different from me. I know, Jim, I told you the story of after I had gone to see some, I came back home to Jacksonville, and I have three younger brothers, and the high school system that they were now in was finally being integrated. They integrated the students, they integrated the faculty. And my mother, God bless her, she was totally against all that, I have to be honest. And she was horrified. And I kept trying to tell my parents, I said, Mom, The real world is integrated. This is better for them to get to know somebody who's different. So I don't know where you want to go from there.
Well, I think a great follow up to that is with the advances of technology, the couple billion people on Facebook and Twitter and whatever other social media, right? That's all gone away. Those boundaries have all gone away. You're now dealing with folks from all over the world. You know, if you come into today's environment with these prejudices, you're really at a huge disadvantage, in my view. How do you feel about that?
No, I certainly agree. I mean, you know more about economic matters than I probably do, but there's kind of a global economy. You know, what happens in China affects what happens here. What happens here affects what happens somewhere else. Mm-hmm. But I often think, what if I had stayed home in Jacksonville? There was a university nearby. It probably was integrated, but there weren't very many foreign exchange students. I know because I used to play in their orchestra when I was in high school. And the experience would have been very, very different. I really do believe that. And you mentioned the Vietnam War. That's where I went on my very first ship. I volunteered to ship out early. I was 18 years old on our Seer train. And that's the first place I went. And, you know, it took me several years after graduation to understand more about that war, what actually happened there, how it started, how brutal it was. And I think the Kings Point and travel experience helped me have a broader mind as well. And I was open to some liberal professor that I met at Tulane telling me that the war was this and that, not what I had heard before. So, 20 years later than that, I've got a partner who was a boy in Vietnam at the time. He was about 9 when I was over there at 18. And he escaped with his life. Quite a story.
Yeah, back several years ago, I was traveling from Hong Kong to Bangkok, and I had taken one of my clients and friends' wives with us to meet in Bangkok for a little holiday weekend while we were working, and we flew over Vietnam. This would have been in the 80s, and you could look down and see the devastation that Agent Orange did to that landscape. It just, if you haven't seen it, you haven't experienced it, it's really hard to express to people that kind of devastation. And when you see those things, you become a little more reluctant today to be anxious to go do similar things elsewhere.
We hope we would learn from our past, yes. Just leave it at that.
Yeah, there you go. Well, but I think as you know, in Long Beach, we have the largest Cambodian population in the United States, probably the second largest population of Cambodians other than Cambodia. And I had a young girl in my class several years ago from Cambodia. Her parents grew up in the camps over there, right? And I was struck one day when I said to the class, how many people know who Pol Pot is? And nobody knew. And I was dumbfounded. So I had her come and do a presentation. And 40 kids left that room with tears in their eyes on what happened over there. And I think one of the benefits of these discussions is not being critical of the past or the future or whatever, but being aware of these things that happen. We were fortunate enough to be born in this country, right? Not necessarily the perfect spots in this country, but we could just as easily have been born somewhere else. And you and I got a chance to see how the rest of the world lives. And
an eye-opener.
Well, they tell you. It's
an eye-opener in a lot of cases because we docked at the waterfronts in the old days, smaller ships right downtown, and some of the most desolate areas of town, very dangerous to even walk across the pier. So you had to get past all of this, even to go uptown to someplace safe and have a beer at a hotel bar. You had to get through this, and you saw people living in tin shacks or worse. And that's a real eye opener.
Well, they tell you when we go to the academy that after Seer you will come back a changed person, and that's probably one of the few lectures that they gave that I probably can validate. uh, we were we were we were working on this 50th anniversary thing, and I was sitting here going through our yearbook the other day at the request of one of my classmates, and just reflecting back on the bizarre stuff that we did while we were there. Again, with folks that we've never met before. In my class, I like to force everybody to work together in a group, right? I like to work with my friends over here. Well, we were never given that opportunity. We were basically thrown together, and you have to learn to adapt very quickly. Same thing when you go on a ship. You have to adapt quickly. You become self-sufficient. When you're at sea, you can't call a plumber. You can't call an electrician. You can't call an electronics guy. You have to fix it.
You can't also you can't choose who to stand watch with either.
That's also true, right? And I think you mentioned the other day I know in my case, one of the reasons I don't gamble is I stood watch for 4 months on a trip to Australia with 3 gamblers, 2 ABs and a ordinary who did look at, and they were card players, professional card players, and they would go ashore, and then when they'd lose their money, they'd go back to sea again. And so 8 hours a day for 4 months, they taught me how to play cards. And pretty much what I learned was don't play with guys that can beat you.
Yeah.
These guys spend a lot of time on this stuff, and you go, oh, gee, let's go play. No, I'll just pass on that. And,
I shipped out of New Orleans for SeaYear, and I lived there right after graduation. And the crews, which were still pretty big in those days, a lot of those guys played a game called Boo-Ray. And it's a gambling game. And if one of the saddest things is after a 2 or 3 month trip, and you're standing in the payoff line and you're watching some of the guys like you're talking about get their money in cash, we got paid in those days, and turn right around and hand it out to the gamblers who've been beating them the whole trip. Try to explain that to your wife. I never got involved with that.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. Well, back to some of the experiences, the unique experiences from our sea years. I didn't go anywhere near as many years as you did, but they were packed full of interesting experiences. I hold up your book, The Bucko Mate, and I'm going to ask you to explain why it's called The Bucko Mate. And then maybe share some of the unique stories of your seagoing career.
Well, the term bucko is an Irish term, which pretty much in English means young buck. So an Irishman might call a friend of his me bucko. And the book is divided into 3 sections. The first section is about when we were students, when I was a student, and it's called Young Blood. It's one of the nicknames we used to have. And Easy Money is the first chapter. That was my first nickname on a ship because I made $3 a day and they could work me as much as they wanted to. So the guys I worked with on deck said I was making easy money. And Bucko Mate is coming out of the academy, 21 years old, ready to go all over the world, navigate ships, really no fear of storms or anything. And then the last part's called the Old Soul, when he starts losing his abilities, mental sharpness, because he's almost 40 years old. So it's the kind of career that can do that to you in 20 years. But the Bucko Mate is it wasn't the original title. The original title was One in the Water, a personal look at going to sea. One in the water because I'm the only one in my family that ever went to sea. Maybe that says all my brothers were smarter than me. I don't know. But, and then one in the water is also an anchoring term. One shot a chain in the water, you got one in the water. And I intended to write a trilogy. The first rough draft, I didn't think I'd get 50 pages, Jim, but what I did is I looked at pictures from ships and discharge papers I had saved, some souvenirs I had bought, some of these memories that we're talking about, and I stopped at 900 pages.
Hey,
and I realized,
I was going through this stuff, some of this stuff yesterday, and I was explaining to my current wife, who's my non-seagoing wife, my non-maritime wife, that coming back from SeaYear, that my roommate, John Pickett, and I were both sent up for what was called a court-martial, but there was a term for it, RBU or R something. You remember what that term was? regimental something or other, right?
No, I don't. I mean,
And,
you got
we
put on
got
the report
we got transfer.
mass list listing who got demerits, but then there was something higher than that.
Yeah, that was the thing higher. Yeah, next stop Vietnam. And she was like stunned. She goes, "Well, what did you do?" So I told her what I did. And see, she goes, "You were probably disrespectful to an officer, weren't you?" And I said, "Well, captain, I guess would be considered an officer, right?"
Yeah.
And so my irreverence for unearned authority was developed at Kings Point and has carried on through through the rest of my career as well.
Well, one of the things I don't know if we mentioned the other day, but in the times that we sailed in the 60s, 70s, even, as I look at the world today, I often think I was very fortunate that the world wasn't in such a chaotic state. Nobody used the word terrorist. I, probably like you, have walked the streets by myself as a 19, 21-year-old kid of Tunis and Tunisia, Tripoli, Libya, Egypt, Israel, places where today, as an American, I would probably fear for my life, or I couldn't even go there.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I used to walk into places, you've probably done this too. I go into a tea shop in an Arab place, and all men in there in robes looking at me. And I would sit down, couldn't read a thing on the menu, and I'd look at what they were having, and I'd just point and say, I'll have that. And I've done this all over the world, China and places like that. I'll have what they're eating. I'll try it.
Mm-hmm.
And then sometimes it was terrible, and sometimes they seemed to appreciate this young American trying local fare, not saying where's the burger all the time.
Yeah.
So I feel lucky in those times that we could move around, I would assume, much easier around the waterfronts and places than you can today in some places.
Well, my sister, I was chatting with my sister who's older than I am, who lives in Columbus, Ohio, which is the center of all presidential elections these days. And
out of Cary, Ohio.
There you go. And she and my brother-in-law pretty conservative, and so we were chatting about some things the other day, and she kind of deferred on an issue to me. She says, "Well, because you've had the global exposure, and we're now in a global economy, I'm going to have to defer to your view because we just don't have that kind of information or experience." And that's it always feels good when a family member views it that way. But it kind of highlights that, many people just haven't been exposed to this information. And of course, their views are developed based on what they're hearing or their particular group that they're in. And so I always encourage people to just be talking to lots of people, strangers, whatever. That was the great thing about going to sea. You were talking to people, 40 different crew members from different places. And of course, the great thing about being a cadet, which is an intern in academia today, was you had coffee time, which was, you'd get 5-6 hours of sea stories a day, for a year. And so all of those experiences, those guys that had gone to sea all those years.
Some of them were actually true, too.
All of them funny.
Yeah. Well, we were talking the other day about an incident that happened to me in Japan. And this was right after graduation. I was 21. Wanted to go commercial Far East because I had never been to Japan and places like that. So I caught a ship out to Japan. First time in my life I ever had more than $10 in my pocket. Got to Japan, wanted to buy a radio. So this would have been 1968. And in my opinion, you're more of the expert, but the Japanese were working very hard to rebuild their economy still. Things were a good bargain over there. So it was considered a good place to buy radios, reel-to-reel tape recorders, all that kind of stuff. And the radio operator went with me, and we met a couple of gals in the store that sold the appliances who spoke English. It was a very enterprising place. They went all up and down the waterfront giving business cards out, all kinds of languages. And when you got to the store, they sized you up as you walked in what you spoke, and they called over the person who spoke your language. Now, at the time, all the young people in Japan spoke English because they had to learn in school. But if you spoke French, they had somebody who could translate French for you. So it was a wonderful place to go. Anyway, we invited these two girls to go out to dinner with us, and they accepted, but we couldn't meet them at the store. They weren't allowed to date customers. And we ended up just having this very innocent dinner for four somewhere out in the suburbs where they took us, where there were no sailors, where there were no just, they're local people. And it was a wonderful experience because they would translate, what am I eating now? And they tell me, and I go, oh my God. So the end of the story, he took his girl home in a cab, and I was going to take mine home. I did in a cab. She gives him the address, and we got to her apartment. And she was attractive, I have to say. If she invited me in, I was coming in. But she felt embarrassed, and she said she still lived with her parents. She said, I can't invite you in because my dad was in the war, and he hates Americans. And I had to tell her, well, my dad was in the war, too, and he would be shocked if he knew I even went to dinner with a Japanese girl. But yet we're another generation. Why should their feelings affect us? So we left it at that, except I think I got a good kiss. I told her that was an American custom. If you had a successful date, you had to kiss your date goodbye, even though we knew we'd never see each other again. And that's as far as it went.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
It's true. I could never tell my parents. They were horrified after a few years of bumming around the world that I would come home with a wife from another country. They were just horrified that this could actually happen. So I used to toy with them a little bit. I said, I met a real pretty Mexican girl when I was in Veracruz last trip. And they go, oh my God, and they get all worried about that. In fact, in high school, there was a real cute Jewish girl that lived not far from us, but I could never date her either because of that. And that's just, those kind of things are just wrong. The other story I think you wanted me to, I don't know how much time we have here,
sure.
is mention of South Africa. During the 1980s, there was a run where the ships went from the New York East Coast to South Africa, sometimes Mozambique, then crossed to Brazil and loaded coffee coming up Brazil, and then went up to Jacksonville, Florida, was the first port discharging this stuff. This is a break bulk ship, a War McCormick Lines ship with booms and stuff. I have a picture of it over there I could get if we need it. But we were having economic sanctions against South Africa because of apartheid. It was a big political discussion, I'm sure you remember. And some of the South Africans didn't take very kindly to us interfering in what they thought was their business. So we were talking about, you don't know what, you have to walk in the other guy's shoes. You don't know what discrimination is like and what happens to you. And starting off, most of the places I went, Americans were welcome because we had money to spend. South Africa wasn't like that. So one night, there were about 4 or 5 of us officers. We all put on a tie, a jacket, went out to a really nice restaurant. And after about 10 minutes, I began to look around and I said, I don't like what's happening here. And they said, what's happening here? And I guess I had, some experience they didn't have. And I said, well, we're being discriminated against. I said, how's that? And I said, well, there's still dirty utensils on the table. They haven't come and offered us a drink. They haven't cleaned this place up. I said, and this is a fenced off section of the restaurant, and every table is full of foreigners. There were Japanese guys over here. There were Americans here. There were other people there. No locals. And having a little more chutzpah back then than I have now, I said, well, I'm not going to put up with this. So I went right to the front podium where the guy in the tuxedo was seating people. And I just raised my voice. I've done this several times in my life. I said, I'm not happy here. And, of course, heads start to turn. I said, sir, would you step aside? I said, I'm not moving from this spot, and don't you touch me. And I let them know what I thought of all this. And the next thing you know, we had a table down front by the dance floor with a free bottle of wine to sample. But I still felt bad that those things were going on, but I sure watched my step around that place. Let me tell you, I didn't open my mouth much. We went into a bar where I was in the men's room, and there was a real young, tough couple of guys in there with hardly any hair. It turned out they were just back from, they were military, and they were just back from a secret mission somewhere. And I heard them, they didn't know me. I fit in unless I opened my mouth. And they were discussing, beating the hell out of all the Americans in the bar. I went back out, and I said, guys, we're leaving.
Yeah, let me work on my Irish accent.
Better be right behind me.
Yeah.
So I always say the good sense of timing was getting out of the bar 30 seconds before the fight starts. That's when you have a sense of timing.
I think the other thing I'd like to chat about is I've been making this point since the Port of LA and Long Beach is the prime entry point for most of the cargo arriving in the United States these days. 12.5% of the GDP of this country goes through that harbor on these big container ships. And of course, none of those big container ships have U.S. flags on them anymore. And I've been kind of suggesting that I find it interesting that Korean Airlines cannot just land an airplane in LAX without landing rights and paying dearly for those landing rights. But yet, a Korean steamship company can just keep sending in these gigantic ships without any recourse. And of course, no American flags, no U.S. crews. I'm kind of curious, having you've been affected by the de-Americanization of the merchant marine, what your view on that might be.
Well, when you and I started, as you said, because of the war, they were actually taking ships out of mothballs to sail over there. Shipping was great. Partly why I joined the union, because I knew I could get to all kinds of different places instead of just the same place. But when the war ended and some of those ships laid up, our union took in a lot of new members. And those guys had enough time and they were full members. So I'm going to say, instead of there being maybe a 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 ratio of officers to billets, jobs, it went to 5 to 6 to 7 to 1. And you just can't make a living unless you've already got a permanent berth somewhere like that. And then some of the companies decided now this is between that time and my last ship was in 87, so from 1968 to 87. Some of the companies declared bankruptcy. Some of them went non-union. Delta Lines, I remember. Keystone Tankers, I was down a dock one time picketing because they were going non-union. And we had quite a bit of arguments with the guys taking the jobs away from us about, something my dad used to have in his little shop. He had a sign which said, I have no complaints with a guy who will work for less than I will. He knows what his time is worth. So, and you would know the larger economic sense, but then somebody figured out, I guess it was the super tankers, when the Suez Canal was closed and they started building super tankers to sail all the way around to make it economically feasible. Sooner or later, I guess it was a McLean trucking guy that started Sealand. He said, why can't we do that with dry cargo? If I can stand a watch on a 500 ship and navigate it, why can't I do it on an 800-foot ship for the same money or maybe a little more? So that's what happened. The crews, when we started, you might have 45 total in a crew. When I finished, you might have 22, 23. They didn't do maintenance. Maintenance was done in a shipyard. It was cheaper and quicker. Nobody chipped and painted. And I remember us feeling, rightly or wrongly, that a lot of other countries subsidized their merchant fleet very heavily. And in our country, we didn't want to. Of course, I have the same problem with passenger trains. We'll talk some other time. I'm an advocate for passenger trains.
Well, I think it's the same. I think it's the same issue of the most cost-effective way of moving freight domestically is via rail. The most cost-effective way of moving people is via rail.
And it uses less energy per passenger mile.
Lower carbon footprint.
Yes.
Right? You now take that same issue and you say, why don't we subsidize the shipyards? Why don't we subsidize, we have the Jones Act, and you've got, you're a senator from Arizona running around trying to say, let's get rid of the Jones Act, right? Which protects, ships running coastwise have to be U.S. flag, American crews. I think there's kind of a security issue there that might be kind of a helpful thought for people to consider. But the other countries that are large maritime entities subsidize that industry for a couple of reasons. Number one, it generates a lot of steel. It's great for their economy. And I think the shock is going to come here in another couple of months when the two largest Chinese carriers merge and they become probably 40% of the marketplace. And maybe people will wake up to the economic risks that they're putting themselves in by not having a federal maritime policy for global trade?
Well, to me, a lot of these transportation issues, ships, rail, airlines, is the things that you don't care about, you say are wasteful, and if they don't make a profit, we should get rid of them. Privatize everything. Put a profit motive into everything. But if you look at national transportation systems, it could be waterways, it could be almost anything. In a lot of countries, it's heavily subsidized. I mean, Amtrak gets 1.4 billion a year. The airlines get 16, and they're all private companies.
Well,
so you've got.
I guess the question on subsidies / entitlements, is there more public good from a subsidy for low carbon, the lowest carbon way of moving people and freight versus peanuts or sugar or drilling for oil?
Why does ExxonMobil need any help from us?
Well, and that's really where the issue is. But because most of the voters, number one, 30-some% of the voters show up for a presidential election, right? That's problem one. Problem number two is many of them don't bother to try to understand these issues. And it gets back to really a value issue on whether or not we view ourselves as a community like the Japanese community does, right? That's a community of people, and the social responsibility in that community is you do for the common before you do for yourself personally. We have a lot of Canadians are more like that than we are, right? And we're paying the price for that, I think, to a large degree. And I think the more communal we get, the cities that are more communal, the states that are more communal, seem to do better overall economically.
Well, it's the economics of, I consider myself, I am an independent. I consider myself pretty much progressive. I've changed a lot over my lifetime, but I really do. People say, well, what do you mean by that? And I say, I will tell you, I believe literally and figuratively, because I've been to sea, that a rising tide lifts all boats. And that's the way I look at the economy. If you, and I don't want to get in a political argument, but I say, okay, some of my neighbors, this comes up, and I say, well, suppose you had $1 million, you're in the government, and you have to spend it to help the economy. And you have two choices. You can give it all to a rich person who has bank accounts in the Cayman Islands or the Switzerland, or you can take 2,000 working poor families and give them $500 cash each to spend any way they want. I know what the moral answer is, and I think I know what the economic answer is.
They're the same.
That money gets spent instantly.
They're the same.
Yeah,
They're exactly the same. I mean, the answer is the same.
I feel
and I think you know, back several years ago, my wife, who's kind of a tree hugger, and she wanted to buy a Lincoln hybrid, right? And I says, tell you what, I think our responsibility is that we put our money where our political mouths are. And so why don't we buy the car that has the largest U.S. labor content to it? Not the corporation, right? But the one that creates the most labor, paid labor in America. And it happens to be the Toyota Camry. And I think to this day, the Camry is still the number one labor content car in the country. And I think just by making those choices, you know, one of our neighbors saw that, and then they did it when they heard. Of course, I have a speech that goes with everything we do around here, right? So, you know, they did that, and then, you know, you just kind of gradually move society to be more communal. It's easier for us because we've experienced both the positive and negatives of how other cultures operate. It's, I think, harder for folks that haven't had those experiences, and that's why I encourage, you know, my audience is that because of the internet, you can get a lot of exposure to information and just be open to it. Try to expose themselves to more points of view as you're able to offer today.
But along with that, I'm sure you advise your younger students to be very cautious of the sources on the internet. There's an awful lot of misinformation out there. And, you know, people, I run into people my age who don't really understand that it's perfectly legal to lie on television, they still think somehow there's somebody checking on that, and there isn't, unless you slandered somebody. So I would caution students to be careful of the source. I get pretty active with politics locally, with issues on trains, and it's amazing what misinformation gets just accepted. I won't tell the specifics, but I have a relative who was all upset, sent me an email some time ago because he'd read that the President of the United States was refusing to sign Eagle Scout certificates anymore. And I said, do you really think someone smart enough to become president would be so stupid as to insult the family of every Boy Scout in America? It's millions of people. It was a rumor. It was nuts.
Sure, sure. Well, one of the things, which is why this interview is so valuable, is we try to teach them how to look at the source and think for themselves. What seems right to you? I mean, just use your own judgment and just take the data in, process it, test it, then make your decision from that. I think if they're willing to do that, look at different points of view, make their decision, whether they agree with or not, that's the process I think gets you to, better outcomes.
Well, you're talking about using your critical thinking skills rather than turn on the TV or radio and just accept as fact what you're hearing.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's hard for me to watch a baseball game without drinking a Budweiser. Yeah.
I don't drink much beer at baseball games. I like to be there to watch the game. I don't want to spend the game in the men's room.
Okay, there you go. That's
my approach to that. But I did want to ask you, I don't want to put you on the spot here, but because I do a lot of reading about a variety of things, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement that's being so controversial, does your course in logistics take a look at things like that, or what happened with NAFTA to our economy here and who benefited and who didn't? I mean, you have students from around the world. Maybe they have a different view on this than some of us.
Well, both the current one that they're discussing and NAFTA are basically the same issue, and that's trying to remove artificial barriers. There's this concept in marketing we call comparative advantage. Vietnam, as an example, has a lot of the manufacturing in China is moving to Vietnam because they've got lower labor costs, right? And then moving even farther south because they have lower labor costs. If your comparative advantage is low labor cost, there's certain products and advantages you're going to have with that. Where we have trouble in this country and in my classrooms is that somebody learns a skill 40 years ago, like how to drive a ship. And you and I are pretty good at that. We came from like the best school there is for learning how to drive a ship, right? When those ships go away, we have two choices. We can sit there and say, hey, I've been aggrieved. You have to go get me a ship. You have to pay me to sit on the bench until you come up with a ship. Or you go get additional skills that are more in demand for the current environment. And that's what you did, and that's what I did. The market keeps changing. It keeps adapting. We had some underlying skills because of our seagoing experience that are easily transferable, right? Self-sufficiency, right? These are soft skills. Right?
It was true, and I had written myself a note about King's Point is if some of your students not aware of military academies, but it was a lot of hard work and a lot of it taught us the values of, I think, of hard work, being on time, watching somebody else's back when they're your buddy, all these kinds of things. But even practically, I remember the engineers used to say, well, Kevin, what are you going to do when you get tired from sea? You're a mate, you're a deckie, you don't have any skills. You're not like me. And I said, well, if you want to spend your life in an engine room, whether you're in a hotel or on a ship, that's your business. I said, I'm pretty flexible. And it took me a while, but some of the skills that I learned on the ships with maps got me a real nice career as a geographic information systems analyst for a local government. I had a huge database, and I got hired for that in part because I understood a lot more about maps, not just the computer.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's
all that chart correcting paid off, right?
Yeah, all that chart correcting.
Yeah. So, well, that's great. You have another book out. You want to share that with us?
You want me to show it?
Sure.
Or did you already do that? Or do you want me to?
It's about baseball.
Well, it just so happens it's a novel based on my experiences coaching baseball to inner city children, mixed race neighborhood where I live, hard scrabble neighborhood, people that worked at Bethlehem Steel Plant and places like that, and they loved their kids' baseball. We had a pretty beat up fields, and the struggle. There are several struggles in the book. The main character just happens to be a mate on a ship who has the whole summer off just the way his work fell. And he's divorced, doesn't have a whole lot of money, he's been through some trouble, and he says, I'm going to coach my kids' baseball team all summer and just do that, concentrate on that. And that's what he does. But the kids in the neighborhood, at the end of the season, they play a tournament or two against all the neighborhoods from all over Maryland. This takes place in Baltimore. And we're talking about suburban teams, fancy uniforms. These kids were lucky if they had a decent pair of sneakers on. And it was a real struggle to get them to compete at that level. They understood there was an economic advantage to having, I remember there's a town there called Cockeysville, which a lot of the Baltimore Oriole baseball players lived in. And we used to go up against them, and there'd be, Cal Ripken's kid could be on a team and somebody like that. And these kids had to compete with that level of coaching and expertise and money. So that's what it's about. I almost think it's better written than the Bucko made. But it is a novel because some of the things that happen didn't really happen. But it's based on a real story of some people that are really struggling and how they deal with it.
Yeah. Well, I think there's some of that in Bucko made as well. You're going to run into some obstacles in your life, and how you handle those obstacles has a lot to do with how you come out at the other end. So I want to thank you for taking the time today. And what I'm going to do is, after we've had a chance to show this to my classes, I'm going to ask if we can get back together again and chat some more about what my classes raise. And then we'll have maybe a second edition. Maybe we'll be able to do it while we're in class. I'll have to see if I can get the technology to work where we can do it live. So
do it live, or you can have them write questions.
I did.
To you,
yeah.
Ask me, or I do have a website, and I can be contacted through that.
Oh, great! Because it's on the guest speaker page of my classes. It has your name and your website there, so they can just click right on there and send your questions.
Just my name, kevinzahn.com.
Yeah, there you go. See, that's pretty easy.
And there's a contact the author button. I can't brag about it because my daughter-in-law's.
Yeah. I looked at it the other day. It's kind of a nice site, and I'll let them complain to you about my Siemens language, my language when I'm telling my sea stories.
Okay.
Thanks again, Kevin.
Thanks. You're welcome.
Talk to you again. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Where's my... Okay.